he was quite adept at that. We're often asked or told, how can Israel sign agreements with its Arab neighbors, peace agreements? Can you trust them? How can you trust them? Now, it's a legitimate question, but it's directed at the wrong party, because the record shows that Arabs have shown a generally remarkable tendency for compliance with their treaty obligations. It is Israel that has violated the formal and informal agreements. Let me now turn to the topic which I suspect brings most of you here today, which is the human rights issues. The human rights issues which reached a dramatic climax with the events in Gaza a little less than a year ago today. And here we have a curiosity when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Whenever there's some sort of incident in the occupied territories, what typically happens is reporters go, journalists go to where the incident is, and then in the newspapers or in the media, I can't speak for Finland, maybe it's different here, but speaking about the States and also about Europe, where I follow some of the press, what typically happens is they say, Palestinians said X happened, Israeli officials said minus X happened, and then the journalists throw their hands in the air. Who knows who's telling the truth? That's how the conflict is reported, or human rights questions. But it's a standard which is not used anywhere else in the world. Because everywhere else, it's perfectly obvious that you don't ask the alleged victim what happened, and you don't ask the alleged perpetrator what happened, because they are both interested parties. They have a stake in what they say. And what you typically do, and you can check for yourself, what they'll do is they'll say, local human rights organizations said, or a representative of Amnesty International said, or a representative of Human Rights Watch said. That is, they don't ask the alleged victim, and they don't ask the alleged perpetrator. They ask a human rights organization which has a long track record for being honest and accurate. But when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, that standard is never used. And it's never used for the perfectly obvious reason that the human rights organizations are always coming up with the wrong answer. And so they have to be systematically ignored and systematically shunted aside. Excuse me. So let's try to illustrate what I have to say by looking at what happened in Gaza between December 27th and January 18th. And once again, I'm going to stick to my self-imposed ground rule of only citing sources which I think we can all agree are unimpeachable, impeccable, and beyond serious question. I'll start with January 2006. The Islamic movement Hamas is elected into office during parliamentary elections in the West Bank and Gaza, elections which Jimmy Carter, the former US president and one of the observers, called completely honest and fair. Well, the United States and Israel weren't pleased with the outcome of those elections, and along with the EU, they immediately imposed a brutal economic blockade or sanctions on the Palestinians in Gaza because they elected the wrong government into power. In the United States, that's called democracy promotion in the Arab world. Then, in June 2007, the United States, along with elements of the Palestinian Authority, they prepared a coup to overthrow the Hamas, the legally elected government in Gaza. That coup is called democracy promotion. And Hamas wasn't pleased with the prospect of democracy being promoted US style. And so they, let's call it, they facilitated the leaving of several elements in the Palestinian Authority. The United States and Israel weren't pleased with that, and so they tightened the economic blockade of Gaza, which Amnesty International called a flagrant violation of international law, for the obvious reason that it was a form of collective punishment. It was imposing brutal economic sanctions which continue till this day on the people of Gaza in order to try to convince them by turning screws to decide to get rid of the Hamas government. Richard Goldstone, in his recent report, he called that blockade of Gaza a possible crime against humanity. The former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, she journeyed to Gaza during those months, and she said, Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. In June 2008, Hamas and Israel entered into a ceasefire. And the ceasefire had obligations on both sides. The Palestinians were supposed to stop their rocket attacks on Israel. And Israel was supposed to gradually lift its illegal blockade of Gaza. According to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. But Israel refused to gradually lift that blockade, which was destroying a civilization. You know, these Arabs are very tricky. They really are. They are very, very sly and tricky. Because even though Israel refused to lift its blockade of Gaza, Hamas kept to the ceasefire. It was careful to maintain the ceasefire. So Israel had a very big problem on its hands because it didn't want Hamas to maintain the ceasefire. They wanted to invade Gaza, and they needed a pretext, an alibi, an excuse. And Hamas was not providing them with an excuse because those tricky Arabs were careful to maintain the ceasefire, even as Israel was refusing to fulfill its obligation of lifting the blockade.